Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Saunders, and I'm here to talk to you guys today about the rhetorical situation, which is essentially a phrase that represents another, let's call it a critical framework to think about rhetoric and rhetorical appeals and how we experience them in everyday life. So this is distinct from, but also I think in many ways relates back to the rhetorical triangle as defined by Aristotle. So the definition, I'm going to give you guys the definition of the rhetorical situation as it's been defined in the Norton textbooks. But I will say that in many ways it's a bit of a nebulous term. There are many definitions. I think one way another way to articulate what the rhetorical situation kind of means is a critical encompassment of kind of the situation in which an argument or an act of rhetoric occurs. So it's defined by Norton as the purpose, the audience, stance, genre, medium, and design. And usually medium design are often conflated, those two. So in terms of thinking about the rhetorical situation, I thought it would be helpful to think about the rhetorical situation in terms of one of our readings from this week. And I chose Rep. Lamar Smith, Climate Change and the Scientific Method. We should welcome new research, not resist it. So I've chosen that reading, and I thought I'd outline the rhetorical situation for this article so we could get an idea of what the rhetorical situation is and how we can think about it in terms of the things that we read. So I would say the purpose of this article is to convince us that climate change is not a problem created by humans, so it thereby cannot be solved by them. I think that the stance is that the scientific method is being warped to claim that climate change is worsening, when really the fluctuations in the Earth's climate are natural and have been happening throughout time. And I would argue that this article was written to reach those who already deny climate change. So I do not think this was a piece of rhetoric that was meant to reach a broad audience. I think it had a specific audience in mind, and I think the language used was meant to galvanize that audience. And I think we have to remember as Rep. Lamar Smith is a elected official who depends on voters, right? So I think that the fact that he's writing this so publicly is largely an attempt to galvanize his voter base or to reach new voters and kind of draw attention to himself in that sense. So the medium/design is Fox News Online. So the publication is Fox News, and we have it in the format of an online article. And the genre, it is a news article. So generally speaking, the rhetorical situation, things to think about. We want to think about the nature and disposition of the audience, the exigence that impels the writer to enter the conversation, the writer's goal or purpose, whatever else has already been said on the subject, and the general state of the world outside the more specific context of the issue at hand. So in terms of the article, one of the articles from this week, one written by Rep. Lamar Smith, I think when we think about the nature and disposition of the audience, we think about the news outlet from which we received it, which would be Fox News, which is, has a very, I would argue, has a specific group of people that news outlet reaches, right? Particularly these days as political conversations have become more polarized than they were previously. I would say that Fox News is largely for people who tend to vote towards the Republican Party. And we know, although I think that this is something that is changing, but I think that people would argue that many Republicans or many people who watch Fox News or read Fox News believe that climate change does not exist. So in that sense, Lamar Smith, he has crafted an article that is perfectly suited for the people it was intended to reach, right? So he's not necessarily trying to convince anyone that's on the fence, right? His language is very strong, but he is intending to kind of galvanize and inspire the people who he is reaching. So the context in terms of the exigence that impels the writer to enter the conversation, I think we're at this time, climate change is a largely politicized issue. We are in a time where there is a lot of natural catastrophe happening, so I think it's on, the argument is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And, you know, presently there's just in the past month or two, there has been a number of wildfires in California, in the north and the south, which have, people have been crying, some people have been crying climate change on that issue. So, and then again, Lamar Smith, he's a public representative and he's someone who is expected to speak to the issue of climate change in terms of how it relates to his voters. So I think in terms of the writer's goal or purpose, I think it largely has to do with the voting body and his base of voters. I don't personally believe that article is written to convince them, but I do think it's meant to kind of inspire them and I guess kind of reach them in a sense, appeal to them. So in terms of what has already been said on the subject, I mean, I feel like the climate change issue is largely polarized. There is alarmists on one side and there's the deniers on the other, and I know he uses some of that language, the language talking about the alarmists as well. The deniers think the alarmists are overreacting about the future. I know Lamar Smith says that how can we predict the future with so many variables and technological innovations? And I think on the other side, you have a lot of like articles that are very heavy in doomsday predictions or very dark predictions about the future of our planet. So in terms of what already has been said, there's been a lot of extreme talk, I think, on both sides. And the general state of the world is that we are experiencing a number of natural catastrophes. There are some who say that it's not climate change or it's not man-created problem, and that there are those who feel differently. But they are happening. So that's something that I believe relates to the general state of the world. So I hope you guys can see how thinking about the rhetorical situation can kind of like deepen your or our own understanding of you know, the nature of rhetoric and how important it is to know, you know, the intended audience as well as the speaker's or writer's purpose and stance. I thought I would choose a quote here from the article as we can think about it in terms of what we've learned by thinking about this article in terms of the rhetorical situation. So Lamar Smith says, furthermore, the idea that anyone can make precise predictions of what kind of climate will exist 85 or more years from now is laughable. There's simply no way to take into consideration climate variables or technological breakthroughs. So I think here we see in his tone, he uses the word like laughable, which I think is in accord with my point about how his language and his tone is strong enough to suggest that he perhaps isn't, his intended audience doesn't include people who are on the fence or people who are undecided about climate change. He is trying to reach and appeal and inspire to people who have already largely made up their minds and want to hear their voices represented by their elected official. And it reminds me of what Aristotle said about knowing your audience, how important it is to know your audience. And I think that's really true for elected officials because they've got to find a way for their voters to appeal to their voters and for their voters to want to vote for them. And then his second point, so he says that anyone could know what could happen in the future is laughable, right? And he says that is because there's simply no way to take into into consideration climate variables or technological breakthroughs. And I think the way that he uses technology is interesting in this piece as well, because it's almost like, kind of like the rhetorical situation as a phrase, it's almost like a nebulous phrase. Like, I see him reference technology a number of times, but I'm never sure what exactly he means when he says technological breakthroughs, if referring to us, inhabiting Mars or living in space. I wasn't quite sure what the word technology meant. And when he's talking about climate variables, I'm sure he's talking about kind of a history of an Earth that cools and warms, which relates back to his major argument about how the scientific method is being warped in favor of the climate change alarmists. So anyways, that's just a little bit about the rhetorical situation, which can be very helpful to thinking about and understanding arguments. And I hope you folks have found this to be helpful.